President Trump seems to be playing hardline with Vladimir Putin in his first 48 hours in office. But is Putin ready to sustain the war for years to come? Or is the Russian economy actually keeping Putin up at night? Plus, we're going to talk about Trump's deployment of 1,500 troops to the border. Are they going to help stabilize the southern border on the United States, or is this just more political theater? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is the tweet from Trump that was as of basically yesterday afternoon. He said, quote, "I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and as always have a very good relationship with President Putin. And this is despite the radical left's Russia, Russia, Russia hoax. We must never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing all the 60 million lives in the process. All of that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy, capital E, is failing, and President Putin one very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which would never have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way should always be better. Let's make a deal. No more lives should be lost." Now, if you follow this channel, you know that I've been saying for literally months that this is the conclusion that Trump is going to have to come to, is that he's going to call Zelensky. Zelensky's going to say what he's been saying for literally 2 years, which is, we're ready to sit down with Russia. Literally, the Ukrainians put on a peace conference, right? They invited Russia, China, Brazil, all the major players, not just their allies. But of course, the only people to show up at all were Western countries. And so it became a discussion about the framework, right? Sort of get the team together and agree on what we're going to say when we do sit down with Russia. But that only occurred because Russia gave the Ukrainians the finger. And for Putin's calculus, as we've talked about, it's very clear why he feels that way. He feels it for the first time, really in the last for the first basically 18 months to 2 years of the war, he was either losing or struggling to achieve any kind of victory. It wasn't until really the Battle of Bakhmut that the Russians were able to produce a tactic that essentially traded large numbers of lives for comparatively small gains. But Russia has those lives to spare. And so now Putin has scaled that tactic across the Russian army. So he feels like he's finally winning. And so when he sees these discussions about negotiations, to him, he interprets that as a statement that the West and NATO and Ukraine are broken and that they are desperately pleading for a settlement. And the reality is that in his calculus, the longer he pursues his current tactical program of these sort of small gains, marginal gains in the East with a focus on attriting the Ukrainian army, even at a tremendous cost to his own, he is going to improve his negotiating position. It's going to get better and better and better. And so what President Trump seems to have concluded is that the only way to get Putin to the table is to credibly make him believe that subsequent pursuit of his offensive is going to diminish his negotiating position. He's going to never be in as good a negotiating position as he is today. And Trump seems to have said, hey, we're going to use these sanctions to do that. There's some problems, most notably that a lot of Russian sales of goods are actually pretty tough. Right now, the reason I say this is because Russia's already subject to intense sanctioning. And so they've worked really hard to work around to make these kind of backroom deals, whether it's with countries like North Korea, Iran, China, notably very much willing to do business with Russia, even though their banks are pretty routinely sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury. You also have countries like India who have signed large deals for Russian raw materials. That's, of course, because India needs to fuel its economy and its regional rival China. India looks at China and goes, man, we cannot allow China to get access to this valuable Russian raw materials, and we don't. It's the potential shift in the balance of power is already too great, right? China's already a massive industrial superpower relative to India especially. And so you have this sort of rebalancing that these countries want to do. And Russia, Putin is a sophisticated actor. He knows he can take advantage of that. The result has been that the Russian economy and the war machine has actually generated enough revenue to sustain itself. But like any sort of car, right, you can cobble together a fix for a while, but ultimately at some point you have to actually address the real problem. And the rumor is that Putin is starting to see that. In fact, he's starting to, according to at least some reports, he's really starting to sweat the state of the Russian economy, right? And this, at the same time, Putin feels that he at least has accomplished enough that if there were to be some kind of settlement, the rumor is that he would actually be willing to accept it, right? Members of the Russian elite are increasingly hoping that a settlement can be reached in the conflict. Now, again, they point out Russia is subject to 13,000 restrictions, but as the military spending has increased, right, and Russia's military spending has increased by about 400% since the start of the war, the fact is that Russia is facing an inflation rate of up to 9%, 9.5% officially. The official number in 2023 was 7.4%. I think the real number is actually higher than this, right? Food, gasoline, housing, and utilities are up way more than 9.5%. They are probably closer to 25 to 30%. Now, the Russian central bank is, they say, unable to raise interest rates to tame inflation, but they could. It's just someone, likely Putin himself, has likely ordered the central bank to stop doing this. Because remember, you have to put yourself in the shoes of Putin, right? Russia is not, because it is not a true democracy, the power and leverage that people have reflect their ability to institute policy changes, right? So that while Putin cannot afford to lose the support of the broad Russian public, he particularly also cannot lose the support of Russia's elite classes. These are people in high levels of government or particularly oligarchs that sort of occupy the elite status, right? Which is probably a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people. And so these business connected or high-level government elites, they are more subject to the actual interest rates on loans, right? That's more of a problem for them than the actual inflation. They're rich. They don't see a meaningful difference between paying 100 rubles for a price of bread and 400 rubles. It's the equivalent of like an average American going, hey, listen, a bag of chips went from 1 cent to 4 cents. You'd go, it doesn't matter. It's so little that it's not meaningful to me. That's how things like utilities and food and transportation costs rising and falling, that's how that feels to a Russian oligarch, right? It feels like a rounding error. But loans, right? Particularly a sanctioned Russian oligarch who can't get a loan from a European or Chinese bank, he has to go to Russian banks for loans, and they're all is going to be paying 21, 22, 23% interest on those loans. Guys, your credit card doesn't charge that kind of interest. So they likely pressured Putin to say, listen, you can't let your central bank raise rates again. I can't continue to fund my companies. And so Putin had told the central bank, you cannot raise interest rates. But there's a problem. Once you tie your hands on interest rates, and if you don't want your currency to plummet in value, right, which is the sort of the other side of the inflation seesaw, right? Inflation go up, currency value go down. Literally, your dollars, your rubles are worth less in a high inflation environment. And so but if Putin doesn't want the ruble to collapse and he doesn't want to raise interest rates, he has only one option left on the table, and that is capital controls, right? Preventing Russians from actually pulling rubles out of the bank, so-called freezing of bank accounts or heavily restricting them. These sort of really hard choices, no good choices left, makes Putin acknowledge that the war has strained the Russian economy and creating really big problems with the high interest rates, even impacting non-war related businesses, according to one Kremlin source. Putin has grown so frustrated, he even shouted at senior economic officials in a meeting at the Kremlin last month, which again makes sense, as we've said on this channel. The central bank likely taking orders from Putin not to raise rates. And again, given the fact that he believes he has effectively weakened the Ukrainian armed forces and controls a fifth of Ukraine, those are objectives. He is at least close enough to what he can call a victory that if the war ends, he will still be able to go back to the Moscow and high five and have little victory parades. So what I want to point out is all of this means that Trump may have actually correctly found a lever for someone like Putin, right? That the economic lever. And I suspect that Trump is publicly using a carrot. If he's smart, he'll also privately have a stick. He'll say, listen, if you end this war, we can really make a good deal, right? The Russian economy can prosper a lot. And I don't love that, right? I don't love the idea that you can get, you can negotiate a better economic deal as a result of invading your partner country. But we also have to live in the real world. And at the end of the day, the real world says that you have to make a deal with you have to play poker at the table you're dealt in at, right? And so I suspect that that's sort of the thing that would happen. And here's the thing with Putin is that he lives in an imperialist Russia world. He still is living in a world in which the amount of territory you plant your flag on is a direct reflection of your personal accomplishment, your personal ability, and your country's prestige. But in an economic world, in a world of globalization and an information economy, power is not that, right? At the end of the day, right, Taiwan manufactures the chips that every single person needs. So it doesn't matter that Taiwan is a tiny country with a has a large military for its size, but a tiny military compared to mainland China. None of that matters because Taiwan has it is a superpower in producing, chips, right? Same with the United States. We don't plant our flag on other countries. Instead, right, what we found is so much more beneficial is to say, listen, we have this incredibly powerful economy. We have this incredible amount of technology. If you want to get access to iPhones, to quantum chips, to our super AI capabilities, have our big tech companies that can do things and help your company sell huge amounts of money, right? They're going to supercharge your economy. You have to engage in a level of friendship with us, right? And cooperation, right? Because again, this is a core economic theory. Trade makes everyone better off, right? It's why the EU, again, it's why when the curtain fell, every single country was like, we want to be a part of the West because we want to be rich, we want a democracy, and the West's conditions are pretty minimal, right? So hopefully this sort of deal that says to Putin, listen, don't become a territory power. You already are. You control a fifth of the world's landmass. Instead, why don't you figure out the reality, which is that you can become an economic power, right? That is the real power in the modern world. And you can see the market seems to believe that this is actually possible, right? Because even though there's so much bad data about the Russian economy, right? January 1st, you can see 22 days ago, the ruble absolutely getting crushed, hitting literally an all-time low. In fact, if we can find it, this is not, an all-time low, but this actually represents a low for the ruble, likely in the last 25 years. Now, you can see it's rebounded a little bit, and that's on optimism that this war might actually end, that Trump may actually get it done. This is a bet that holding rubles is going to look better, not worse, in the coming months. Now, what I wanted to, I got an interesting text the other day from one of the units we met in Ukraine. And actually, we were asking them, we're like, hey, we did this fundraiser. UAO was like, what do you guys need? Right? You obviously tremendously took some real risks to meet with Paul, to do these interviews, to talk to him. What do you guys need? And they said, listen, we want two things. We want a Mavic 3T with the thermal sights. We want to be able to do some night reconnaissance. It's cold out there, and Russians in the dark just glow in a thermal sight. And they said, and our pilots say, send more gum. Why? Because strike gum was designed by a combat veteran, by me, right? We tested thousands of different combinations, and ultimately, I found that Strike Gum with 90 milligrams of caffeine, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, just 10 calories, has a refreshing mint flavor, tastes great, gives you a caffeine kick equal to that of a Red Bull or an Amp Energy in just a little convenient package, right? So that if you are whether you're a drone pilot flying for 12 hours straight, and you need to lock in, or you're a cop working another swing shift, or you're a nurse, or maybe you're just a guy who makes a lot of YouTube videos and needs to stay locked in to do hours and hours of editing, Strike Gum has your back, right? Get the only combat-tested energy gum, right? And of course, guys, as always, I'm going to throw the link in the description. If you are a service member deployed and you're willing to snap us a cool pic of Strike Gum in a badass location, let us know. It's got to be an APO address, right? We're not going to just send it to you, but we'll send you a free pack. You send us a pic, and that we can use, right? Don't take pics of your classified information, and we'll send you some more Strike Gum and some swag. So help us out, right? The email to that's in the description. But if you just want to pick up Strike Gum because you need your energy, dude, links in the description. StrikeGum.com or on Amazon. Just search Strike Gum. You can't miss it. It's the highest rated energy gum on Amazon. Plus, we're made in the USA, right? We're here to look out for America. Okay. Now, Ukraine, I want to point out, also has their own inflation rate problems. Fascinating, though, the Ukraine central bank actually has a lower rate than the Russian central bank. So somehow, insanely, despite the fact that the Ukrainian country is literally being invaded, they still are able to maintain a substantially, like by 8%, lower inflation, central bank rate to fight inflation. But here's the other thing to take away from this. You go, oh, the Ukrainian economy is bad too, right? But think about the Vietnam War. The U.S. was in a war of choice. And the public, they sort of tolerated it, right? Up until the casualties became pretty high. The North Vietnamese, though, they were fighting a war on their home turf for to make their country whole, right? They believed they were fighting for their people, for their own existence. And when you're in an existential war, the public of that country is willing to stomach so much more. And that's one of the things that sort of defined Ukraine, is that while the average Russian, really, the Ukraine is a war happening over there where somebody else is getting killed. For the Ukrainians, this is a fight for survival, right? And you're just going to be willing to tolerate a level of pain that your opponent, right, even if they're larger, might not be willing to tolerate. And that is itself its own advantage. So even though Ukraine has similar problems, Ukraine has a tremendous motivation to endure those problems, right? Now, what I also want to talk about is an interesting leak that came out of a Ukrainian investigative reporter who obtained some emails from Wagner Group, right? The late Prigozhin and his Wagner troops, Wagner's still operating, but they're not operating in Ukraine, right? Instead, that Wagner Group has been moved back into Africa under a different leadership that's seen as a little bit more Kremlin loyal. And the idea is that the Wagner troops are too valuable to just disband, right? The last thing Putin wants is a bunch of people who hate him and are highly trained in military operations to just let them loose in his country. But he also can't let them loose in Ukraine because Wagner feels pretty betrayed by the Russian government. So he said, listen, why don't you guys go as far away from me as you can possibly go into Africa? Well, they've exposed what Wagner's been up to in Africa, and lads, it is not above board. Right? For example, they have been working with and contracting with a number of armed groups in West Africa, including the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Nigeria. They are taking money from this Al-Qaeda affiliate in exchange for attacking Western oil companies. Jihadists are helping to arm militants in the Niger Delta under an agreement with the Russians. After the first attacks on Western companies, these are Western oil companies, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb will take responsibility. So we're looking at Wagner and Al-Qaeda actually working hand in hand to attack Western oil interests, right? And of course, a Wagner mercenary negotiating about the attacks on video said, quote, all of this will soon come crashing down on your company, which destabilizes the situation in West Africa, cooperates with terrorists, and is waging an indirect war against the West. So this is all kind of steeped in this idea that anything to strike a blow against the West to make the Wagner Group more money, and it doesn't matter who else is involved in this, right? Anyway, there's more, right? Of course, it shouldn't shock anybody to be like Al-Qaeda, Wagner, right? That's how mercenaries work, guys. I don't know what else to tell you. What did you think it meant to be a mercenary? If they can pay, then they will work with them. And if it serves Russia's political objectives, all the better. This is pretty standard. This is actually a pretty standard practice. Now, obviously, working with terrorists is kind of messed up. But if you look at someone like Blackwater, right, they're never going to position themselves against U.S. interests, but they are always first and foremost looking to get paid. So they would never take a contract with a terrorist, but they might, for example, and they famously have on several occasions, maybe not Blackwater or what do they call themselves now, Triple Canopy or DynCorp, but many of these independent security contracting companies do take gigs with U.S. allies who have, let's say, a questionable relationship with human rights, like the Qataris, for example, or the Saudis, right, where they will hire these security consultants or whatever, mercenaries, to persecute their political opponents, something that is ethically abhorrent in the United States, but is fine for a U.S. ally to do. Again. So this is, again, a standard Russian playbook. But let's talk about one other really interesting story. 1,500 U.S. soldiers are heading to the southern border, right? This is in response to a Trump executive order ordering 1,500 active duty service members and additional air and intelligence assets to the southern border to augment troops already conducting enforcement operations in that region, according to Acting Secretary of Defense Robert Sales, right? They said, quote, to protect the security of the United States citizens, President Trump declared a national emergency on the southern border. The president directed me to take all appropriate action to support the activities of the Secretary of Homeland Security in obtaining complete operational control of the southern border in the United States. And I want to point out that this is a spelling error. You're supposed to capitalize Secretary, Homeland Security, right? They are proper nouns. I feel like I'm the only person left in the country who speaks actual proper English, or writes in proper English, rather, right? Now, they'll be put to work on the placement of physical barriers and other border missions within 24 hours. This includes 1,000 soldiers and 500 Marines who are in standby in Southern California to help combat the Los Angeles wildfires. From out of the frying pan into the fire, or out of the fire into the frying pan, or the panhandle. Now, this is on top of 2,500 active duty personnel in the region. Now, here's the thing, guys. Is this going to make a difference? Can active duty troops even conduct law enforcement in the United States? Unfortunately, in 2021, this has been attempted, actually. In fact, remember, the Operation Phoenix or Task Force Phoenix was in 2021, 4 years ago, given this exact same mission, right? And this was originally an active duty brigade combat team, but then became a hodgepodge of National Guard units. And they interviewed, in this article here, by the Army Times, interviewed one of these soldiers from Task Force Phoenix. And here is what one of their senior staff officers described of what they did. They said, quote, being at the border, we could be saving billions of dollars if we actually funded Customs and Border Protection instead of using the Guard, the Army National Guard, as a Band-Aid, said an officer who served at the border last year. He continued, quote, we're useless, and CBP treats us like we're useless. We cost the taxpayer millions of dollars in pay, benefits, per diem, hotels, and vehicle rentals, right? And even a congressman, former Marine, I think his name is Gallego said, quote, if we want to secure the border, 100 customs officers is better than 100 National Guardsmen, right? It feels warm and fuzzy to say we have guys with camouflage down on the border, but it's just politicians playing with people's emotions. The troops don't actually end up being effective, and you're eroding our military capability for real threats. all you're doing is taking guardsmen away from their families, taking people away from actual training. You're screwing with readiness. Now, here's the problem, right? And if you're wondering why you should listen to me on this, I spent 7 years in the Department of Homeland Security, their internal affairs office, the inspector general, and my portfolio was heavily into border and immigration. And so I've been to essentially every major crossing point, every major port of entry in the entire border, as well as every single Border Patrol sector from San Ysidro all the way to the Rio Grande Valley. I've seen every central processing center. I've interviewed probably something on the order of 200 to 300 agents and officers from CBP and Border Patrol, or OFO and Border Patrol. And I've seen these military assistance operations in real time. And I can tell you, they're completely right. And it's not because the military is bad at their job. It's because there are some really important laws that the U.S. absolutely will not violate, right? And one of those laws is called the Posse Comitatus Act. And that says that troops cannot engage in law enforcement. Why? Because they can't engage in law enforcement without basically an act of Congress. And the reason is because troops doing law enforcement looks a lot like martial law. And the U.S. was like, listen, we are not going to become a Latin American dictatorship where if, imagine if instead of the politician you don't like is in the White House, and that politician decides that they're tired of all these pesky protesters complaining about their rights and freedoms. And so it says, listen, I'm going to have the military, I'm going to make them the new law enforcement, and they're going to enforce the law with Apache attack helicopters and artillery, right? Plus, we have a longstanding principle in this country of the separation and civilian control of the military. So the military is responsible for defending the country from military threats, but enforcing the law is the responsibility of law enforcement, federal law enforcement. And that's a pretty bright line. That means, though, that anything that looks like enforcement of a law is not going to be able to be performed by the military. Now, that doesn't mean they can't do anything, but a lot of what they do is, well, like this soldier here, just staring at stuff, right? Looking through cameras. I also observed the Army personnel doing very routine things. For example, individuals that are detained and held in central processing facilities while they go through the immigration process or get repatriated, right? While Border Patrol figures out who are you, what are you doing in the country? Maybe you're actually a citizen. Are you wanted in your home country for a crime? Who are you? What are you doing? And what is your immigration status? Do you have a visa? Do you not? While those people are being detained, which could sometimes number in the tens of thousands at any one time, soldiers would, for example, give those people food. They would sometimes escort them. If one said, hey, I have to use the bathroom, the soldier would go and escort them. They'd say, hey, I'm actually feeling kind of sick, or my kid feels sick. Can I see a doctor or a nurse? The soldiers would escort them to a doctor or nurse. That's the kind of really just elite tier stuff that these guys are doing. And so it's not nothing. You ask the Border Patrol, some of them will say, yeah, it's pretty helpful because our agents, right, need to focus on like the law enforcement side of the job. And so if one of my agents who should be arresting bad guys or processing processing individuals who enter the country, if they are stuck handing out sandwiches, it's a waste of their time. And it's very, very hard for the government to sort of get out of its own way in this case. And soldiers can sometimes help a little bit around the edges. But if you think the solution to the border is thousands of soldiers, it's not, right? A few hundred, sure, there's some utility there. But a lot of these guys, sometimes it's so expensive to deploy soldiers because, well, they're just really expensive that sometimes they can't get out of their own way. For example, the Army Times found that in the 2 years prior to their article, they found that troops at the border had 3 times as many car accidents in the prior 12 months than the number of times they found illegal drugs. So literally, they were crashing their car. For every one time they helped, because again, they can't do law enforcement. So you cannot, if you see drugs crossing the border, that's a job for a law enforcement officer. But they could help, probably by like watching a bad guy or something, right? They did that 147 times in a year. But they got in 500 car accidents, which is insane, right? In fact, an entire cavalry company from Louisiana, cavalry companies are called troops. A cavalry troop from Louisiana was literally disbanded because there was so much misconduct and command climate issues, right? In fact, 1,000 soldier battalion task force deployed to McAllen, 3 soldiers died on the border deployment. In fact, for comparison, only 3 National Guards deployed were killed anywhere during deployments in 2021. So literally, this 1,000 soldier deployment to McAllen, we saw more soldiers killed, and they're not killed by like in cartel gunfights. All right. These guys are killed in DUIs, in suicides. I don't know if I can say suicide on YouTube, but that's what it is. That's reality. That proved more lethal than all of the National Guard deployments elsewhere in the country in 2021, or elsewhere in the globe. So again, the takeaway from here is that this is probably political theater. Now, what wouldn't be political theater is hiring more Border Patrol agents, or expediting the hiring process for Border Patrol agents, or creating what they talked about, a sort of professional helper, a non-law enforcement. They wouldn't be called a Border Patrol agent, or they'd be called probably something like a detention service manager or something, someone who can do these kind of routine tasks, or a processing agent is what I heard them sometimes called, where they don't do law enforcement. They just handle the paperwork. They handle the logistics. They do everything they can to take the logistical challenge of processing and holding large numbers of migrants, and take that off the plate of the agents so they can focus on law enforcement, right? But the question is, will Congress engage in political theater, or will they engage in real fixes? And unfortunately, we've seen both sides of the aisle being unwilling to do this. They don't engage in political fixes. Again, in 7 years, right, I saw the same problems I did, right, 2 administrations. I saw the same problems I did when I joined as I did 7 years later. No meaningful reform to the actual system, right? And why would you, right? Twice now, the election's been basically decided by immigration issues. And the people who get the rawest deal in all this are low-level Border Patrol agents who work their fucking asses off and take tremendous risks for pretty low pay, and migrants themselves. Right? So, like, guess what? The politicians don't give a shit about either of those people. They don't give a shit about almost any regular person. And they'll be willing to sacrifice those guys in order to get a leg up in an election. And they do. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to folks like James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, James Allner, Henry Roussier. Thanks to all the Lieutenant tier members. We're going to be doing our Q&A later today, so make sure you join us over on combatvetnews.com. See ya. Cheers.